The prairie stretched wide and merciless under a sun that had long since burned the morning mist away. Dust rose in lazy spirals from the dry earth, stirred by the wind, and the lone figure atop a weary horse cut a solitary path toward the small settlement that clung to the edge of the horizon. He rode with the easy steadiness of a man accustomed to riding for hours on end, shoulders heavy with the quiet weight of grief and years spent alone. His hat, sun-bleached and frayed at the brim, shadowed eyes that had seen more loss than most men carried in a lifetime. Dust fell from his boots as he dismounted near the corral, the iron hinges of the gate groaning like a tired old man welcoming another day. The townsfolk, scattered in small clusters, turned their heads toward him with cautious eyes, their murmurs soft but sharp. He paid them no heed, his attention drawn instead to a field beyond the corral where a figure shivered in the sun. At first she seemed merely a child left behind, hair tangled and dress hanging in disarray, but as he drew closer, the truth struck him like a sudden gust of wind. She was bound to a fence, her wrists raw and bleeding where rope had bitten into the skin, and the hem of her dress torn from careless neglect. The sight twisted something deep in his chest, a knot of memory and sorrow, and he felt an urgent, almost reflexive need to act. He approached slowly, the creak of his saddle leather sounding unnervingly loud in the open field. The girl's eyes were wide, rimmed with the faint red of tears and sunburn, darting from the fence to the distant edge of town as though seeking any escape. Her small frame trembled, not merely from the rope that held her, but from the invisible weight of abandonment, the ache of trust shattered by a father's drunken cruelty. He crouched, careful not to startle her, and with steady, deliberate movements, loosened the ropes that had imprisoned her. The coarse rope fell to the ground with a soft thud, dust rising where it landed. When she finally stood, her legs wobbling beneath her, he offered her a hand, worn and scarred from years of honest labor and long roads, not knowing whether she would take it or flee. Her fingers brushed his in tentative contact, and she let herself be guided toward the horse, the first sensation of safety she had known in months. Around them, the town whispered and watched, eyes narrowed with suspicion, tongues wagged with judgment, but he ignored them. There was no room for argument here, only the quiet necessity of protection, the unspoken promise that she would not be left to the cruelty of men again. He swung onto the horse with a practiced ease, offering her the saddle behind him. Hesitation lingered on her face, but something in his quiet steadiness, the way he spoke without hurry, the way his gaze did not demand explanation, allowed her to climb up, trembling but willing. The ride to his cabin was slow, deliberate. Dust clouds trailed behind them, curling in the wind, catching the last slants of the afternoon sun and painting everything in shades of gold and amber. The air was heavy with the scent of rain still clinging to the distant hills, a promise of storms to come, and the clouds above hung low and dark as though mirroring the weight of their unspoken grief. Each step of the horse against the hard-packed earth was a pulse of patience, a quiet rhythm that echoed the first fragile heartbeat of trust forming between them. The girl's hands, small and raw from rope burns, rested lightly on his waist, seeking contact yet not insisting on it, and he felt the faint tremor of life returning to a soul that had been long neglected. They passed fields where the grass was browned and brittle, the skeletons of old fences jutting skyward like memory's jagged edges. The cowboy noted each detail in silence, the cracked boards, the iron tools leaning abandoned, the faint tracks of previous wanderers. And it struck him how the land itself bore witness to endurance, to lives lived quietly against hardship. He did not speak much. His presence was enough, and slowly, the girl began to speak too, halting words at first, whispers of her father's drinking, the emptiness of her nights, the fear that no one would ever care for her. He listened, never interrupting, letting the fire of acknowledgement burn gently in the silence between them. At the cabin, modest and solitary against the rising wind, he led her inside, the wooden floorboards creaking under the weight of tentative hope. He stoked the hearth, the dry timbers catching flame with a soft crackle, filling the small room with warmth and the smell of burning pine. The girl wrapped a borrowed shawl around her shoulders, and for the first time, her eyes softened, reflecting firelight rather than fear. The cowboy watched, feeling the first stirrings of something he had long thought lost. The recognition that protection was not merely the lifting of hands or the drawing of rifles, but the steady constancy of presence, the patience to stand through fear and uncertainty. Outside, the storm clouds finally broke, and rain fell in scattered sheets, pattering against the tin roof and the lone window panes. Each drop carried a promise of cleansing, of renewal, of grief washed into the soil to nourish the new green that would come. The cowboy, seated on the rocking chair, worn smooth by years of solitary evenings, allowed himself a long, slow exhale. The girl moved to the hearth, warming her fingers, and a fragile trust began to root itself in the small cabin, intertwining with the dust, the shadows, and the scent of wet earth that had followed them home. For both, the day ended in quiet understanding. The girl's survival required more than physical rescue. It demanded patience, compassion, and the slow building of faith in another's steadfastness. And the cowboy, too, felt the stirrings of a connection he had long denied himself, realizing that even in a life defined by loneliness, there could exist the tender pull of companionship. They had not yet spoken of the future, nor dared to name the bond forming between them, but the first fragile threads were in place, spun in dust, shadow, and firelight, carrying the quiet promise of trust, protection, and a life slowly stitched together from the remnants of past sorrows. The cabin smelled of smoke, dry pine, and the faint lingering tang of old leather. Outside, rain pattered against the tin roof, the rhythm a soft, unceasing reminder of the storm that had passed and the one that still lingered in memory. The cowboy knelt beside the girl, hands calloused but gentle, inspecting the raw marks on her wrists. He dabbed a rag in warm water, careful not to startle her, and pressed it against bruises that had darkened like bruised fruit left in the sun too long. The firelight flickered across the rough-hewn walls, casting shadows that danced with an almost sentient sorrow, and she shivered partly from the chill, partly from the weight of recollection that clung to her like smoke to a chimney. He did not speak much, only moved with deliberate calm, the kind of patience honed by decades of solitude. When she finally wrapped a threadbare shawl around her shoulders, drawing it tightly as though to hold herself together, her voice broke the quiet. It was hesitant at first, like the tapping of a cautious bird against a window pane, then steadier, a fragile unfolding of memory. She told him of nights spent listening to the slurred tirades of a father too drunk to notice her, of meals skipped or cold, of the endless hours spent waiting for someone, anyone, to care. Her words hung in the air, mingling with the scent of smoke and rain, filling the room with the weight of things long endured in silence. He listened. He did not offer platitudes, did not turn her grief into lesson or lecture. Instead, he allowed the silence to answer, letting the warmth of fire and the steadiness of his presence speak where words could not. Then, cautiously, almost as though testing the water before diving, he shared glimpses of his own past. A wife lost to fever, a home emptied of laughter, evenings measured in the slow tick of a clock and the creak of a rocking chair. The lines on his face were not merely etched by age, but by sorrow, by the accumulation of lonely years spent speaking to shadows and memory alike. His stories were not invitations for pity, only the bare offering of truth, a mirror to the girl's own suffering. She brushed at the dust in her hair with trembling fingers, eyes flicking to the marks along his forearms and hands. There were scars there, long pale lines, and near the mantel, old tools leaned against the wall, a hammer, a worn saw, a spade with a splintered handle. Each item seemed to hum with quiet testament, symbols of endurance, labor, and moral steadiness. In the small cabin, the firelight made everything intimate. The rough textures of wood, the curve of his hands, the delicate shadow of a braid that had fallen loose from her hair. For the first time in many weeks, she felt seen, not merely as someone to be rescued, but as someone who mattered enough to be acknowledged in her entirety. Scars and all. The rain outside softened, but the chill lingered in the corners of the room. The girl folded her hands over her knees and looked down at them, noticing the trembling, noticing the lines etched by rope burns, by nights spent trying to curl small into herself and vanish. She realized how heavy the weight of abandonment could be, heavier even than hunger or cold. And yet, sitting across from her in the quiet warmth, the cowboy seemed a living promise that weight could be carried, that even in the harshest light of day, a steady presence could bear witness without judgment. They spoke little as hours passed, but the conversation in silence was rich. Each glance, each movement, an unspoken exchange of understanding. She found herself noticing small things, the way he tended the fire, stirring embers carefully. The way his eyes lingered on the horizon, even from inside the cabin, as though searching for something lost but not yet found. The way the smoke curled in lazy spirals and carried with it the scent of both warmth and solitude. In return, he noted her tentative movements, how she adjusted the shawl around her shoulders, how her eyes flickered with caution before meeting his. Each gesture, each careful motion became a dialogue of trust, a language neither had spoken aloud, but both understood. Even as she settled closer to the fire, feeling the slow return of warmth to her fingers, she recognized that emotional wounds lingered longer than the physical ones. Rope burns would fade, bruises would vanish, but the hollow ache of abandonment could stretch across years if left unacknowledged. He had felt that ache too. He had lived it, and his quiet endurance gave her a model for her own fragile courage. She realized that survival was not merely escaping harm. It was learning to remain present, to breathe through fear, to accept that trust could be extended without promise of perfection, only promise of constancy. The cabin, modest and unadorned, had become a sanctuary of shared solitude. Shadows flickered across the walls as firelight danced in cadence with the dwindling hours of daylight, painting a tableau of quiet intimacy. The girl seated on a worn rug, the cowboy leaning against the mantel, tools and memories around them like silent companions. The storm outside had left the air crisp and clean, carrying with it the scent of wet earth and the faint promise of renewal. For a moment, both allowed themselves to simply be, to feel the subtle pulse of connection threading through the room, delicate as a spider's silk, but no less resilient. In the hush of evening, the cowboy stirred water for coffee, the faint hiss and scent rising to mingle with the lingering smell of fire and wet wood. The girl watched, noting the small, ordinary tasks that had become almost sacred in their quiet repetition. It was not the grand gestures that defined protection, she realized, but the slow accumulation of attention, the meticulous care that stitched broken lives into semblances of normalcy. And he, in turn, felt a quiet satisfaction in witnessing her tentative engagement with the world, a fragile, wordless acknowledgement that survival did not have to mean solitude, that even those marred by neglect and sorrow could begin again. By nightfall, the fire had burned low, embers glowing faintly in the hearth. Outside, the prairie lay cloaked in mist, a silent witness to the small sanctuary inside the cabin. The girl, wrapped in the threadbare shawl, finally allowed herself to exhale fully, to release the tension she had carried for so long. And the cowboy, leaning back in the rocking chair, felt the gentle tug of hope, a quiet certainty that the work of protection and care was beginning to take root, that even amidst loss, connection, trust, and survival were possible. The shadows of the past still lingered, but in the warmth of the cabin, in the soft glow of firelight, they were no longer unbearable. They were shared, acknowledged, and slowly, tenderly, being transformed. Rain arrived suddenly, a curtain of silver falling in relentless sheets, hammering against the tin roof of the cabin and bouncing across the prairie like 1,000 restless hands. The wind whipped the loose boards of the cabin with impatient urgency, rattling windows and carrying the scent of wet earth and ozone from distant lightning strikes. Inside, the girl clutched the threadbare shawl closer to her shoulders, watching the fire tremble in its hearth, each flicker and crackle reflecting her own unease. The cowboy moved with measured calm, stoking the flames, his hands steady even as the storm outside seemed intent on unmaking the world. Then, over the steady patter of rain, came a sound that was not of the storm, the hard clatter of hooves on mud, deliberate and heavy. A rider appeared through the curtain of rain, shoulders squared against the wind, a wide-brimmed hat pulled low, eyes glinting with threat beneath the brim. The stranger's horse snorted and pawed at the earth, mud splashing against leather boots. His voice, carried in a rough, sharp edge, claimed grievances that sounded hollow yet dangerous, an unjust complaint, a demand, a claim of retribution on account of the girl's family. The words were harsh, meant to intimidate, and yet they struck against the walls of the cabin like the storm outside. A tempest made human. The cowboy rose slowly, boots creaking against the worn wooden floor, and lifted the rifle from its peg near the mantel. He did not shout, did not step forward with anger. His presence was quiet but unyielding, a rock against the battering winds, a promise of immovable resolve. His eyes, dark and steady beneath the brim of his hat, met the stranger's, unflinching. The girl, standing behind him, pressed closer, feeling the warmth of his steadiness, sensing the invisible shield of protection he offered without boast or declaration. The storm raged in symphony with the tension inside. Lightning flashed across the windows, illuminating faces and furniture in stark, fleeting brilliance, and thunder rolled like distant judgment, punctuating each moment with sound and vibration. The stranger dismounted with clumsy arrogance, the mud sucking at his boots, the rain soaking the brim of his hat and the leather of his coat. Words were exchanged, threats veiled thinly as demands, but the cowboy did not falter. He raised the rifle just enough to make intent clear, yet never moved with unnecessary haste. The girl's heart hammered in her chest, not from fear alone, but from awe. She had never seen courage worn like this. Quiet, deliberate, and resolute. A courage that did not shout but held firm even when every element seemed poised against it. She recognized in it the echo of her own need for strength. The strength she had glimpsed in him since the day he had freed her from the fence. Outside, lightning split the sky, striking far-off ridges and sending reverberations through the cabin walls. Rain fell in torrents, drumming against the roof, sluicing down the windows in streaks that blurred the landscape into watercolor of gray and silver. Each flash highlighted the rifle, the stance of the cowboy, and the tension coiling between the two men like a drawn bowstring. The girl shifted her weight, noticing small details. The way his fingers tightened just slightly on the wood of the rifle, the set of his jaw, the tilt of his head as he calculated distance and threat. She saw in those quiet movements not recklessness, but moral clarity, a willingness to act with courage even when the outcome was uncertain. The stranger's threats began to falter, unaccustomed to resistance that did not waver, to defiance that spoke not in anger but in principle. The cowboy's eyes held him, silent and unwavering, a storm within the calm of the cabin. In that charged space, with firelight flickering across rough walls, shadows danced on the floor like specters of past sorrows and past wrongs. The storm outside mirrored the chaos within. Lightning, rain, wind, each a symbol of turbulence, both moral and elemental, of danger that was both external and internal. And yet as the confrontation stretched, the storm began to feel less like menace and more like cleansing, a reminder that turbulence could purge, that fear faced with steadfastness could transform into clarity. Finally, after tense moments that stretched as long as the prairie horizon itself, the stranger retreated. His horse stamped in impatience, the wind carrying the edge of his cursing away into the rain. The cowboy lowered the rifle slowly, every movement deliberate, and turned toward the girl. She met his gaze, eyes wide, tentative yet full of a quiet awe. He did not speak, only nodded once, a subtle acknowledgement of the shared ordeal. Her hands, still trembling slightly, found the warmth of his sleeve for a fleeting moment, and the first unspoken bond of trust. Forged in fear and courage, strengthened quietly, irrevocably. The fire's warmth seemed deeper now, more intimate, as if it had absorbed some of the tension and transformed it into reassurance. Rain drummed more softly against the roof, the first signs of calm threading through the roar of the storm. Outside, the prairie glistened with moisture, each blade of grass reflecting the lightning in mirrored shards, and the smell of wet earth rose through the cabin, mingling with smoke and the faint musk of worn leather. The girl, settling onto a rough rug, allowed herself to feel the safety she had only glimpsed before. She realized for the first time since being bound to that fence that courage and protection could coexist, that she could be guarded not through harsh words or visible force alone, but through presence, steadfastness, and moral clarity. In that night, the cabin became a sanctuary not merely from the storm, but from the lingering specters of past neglect and fear. The cowboy moved silently about, tending to small chores, stoking embers, checking the windows, ensuring their shelter was secure. The girl watched, noting each movement, and understood that the measure of a protector was not in heroics but in constancy. The storm had raged, lightning and wind shaking the edges of their world, but in its aftermath, the bond between them had solidified. Protection was not passive. Courage demanded presence, vigilance, and a willingness to stand against danger even when it threatened solitude and peace. By the time the rain slowed to a soft mist, and the wind whispered rather than screamed, both had settled into a quiet rhythm. The girl, her shawl wrapped snugly, traced the firelight across the walls, noting shadows and textures that told stories of resilience and survival. The cowboy, leaning back against the mantel, rifle resting nearby, allowed himself a long, slow breath, knowing that they had weathered more than a storm outside. They had faced fear together and the unspoken understanding. The shared tension had forged a fragile, enduring alliance. Outside, the prairie glistened in the muted moonlight, wet and glistening as though the land itself bore witness to the small, steadfast courage that had been exercised within its bounds. Inside, the cabin hummed with warmth, trust, and the promise of endurance, the storm leaving behind not just wet earth, but clarity, bond, and the first faint stirrings of hope. The rain had long since ceased, leaving the prairie glistening under a tentative sun that fought its way through retreating clouds. Days had passed in quiet routines, the cabin now a fragile haven against the vast loneliness of the plains. The girl moved with careful diligence, carrying a kettle to the hearth, stacking firewood in neat piles beside the door, and mending small breaks in the fence that marked the boundary of their modest land. Each motion was deliberate, a tentative claim on domestic normalcy, and she felt the first subtle satisfaction in the rhythm of purposeful labor. She would pause sometimes, glancing out the window at the wind-stirred grass, at the distant hills where mist clung like memory. And for a moment, the weight of past neglect lifted from her shoulders. The cowboy worked nearby, silent, tending to his own chores, cleaning the rifle, patching a worn saddle, moving logs with careful efficiency. His eyes, dark and reflective, occasionally flicked toward her, noting small gestures, the way her fingers curled around the kettle, how she adjusted her shawl to ward off the chill, the almost imperceptible tightening of her jaw as she concentrated. Their glances met sometimes, brief and loaded with unspoken meaning, each one an acknowledgement of presence, of tentative trust being forged in small, everyday actions. Neither spoke much. The silence between them carried weight, a language richer than words, filled with observation, care, and the slow weaving of connection. Yet tension lingered, like the last shadows of a storm receding across the prairie. Misunderstandings flared in quiet bursts, a glance misread as impatience, a casual word interpreted as criticism. Fear and pride clashed with the tender stirrings of admiration and tentative attraction. The girl recoiled briefly when he approached to guide her hand while mending a fence, her mistrust visible in the tightening of her fingers around the rough wood. He noticed and stepped back, offering only a nod, a quiet promise of patience rather than rebuke. In those small moments, the cabin became a landscape of negotiation, of learning the limits of touch, of understanding the fragility of trust after long neglect. Healing surfaced in subtle symbolism. The broken rocking chair, its arms splintered and worn, was slowly repaired, each stroke of sanded wood and tightened joint a meditation in restoration. A braid that had come undone during hurried flight was gently redone, fingers working with delicate care, weaving strands into order and quiet beauty. Each small act of repair was mirrored by the slow rebuilding of confidence, of intimacy, and of quiet hope. Even as they worked, they shared glances that lingered a little longer, smiles that softened the edges of tension, and moments where laughter hovered, but did not break the solemn rhythm of care and labor. The cabin itself seemed to breathe with them, alive with subtle change, the scent of boiled coffee, the warmth of drying firewood, the faint echoes of ordinary conversation reclaiming the space from silence and fear. Some afternoons, they would pause to sit by the window, watching the prairie soak in the remnants of rain. Mist clung to the tall grass, and the distant horizon shimmered with a fragile gold as the sun slipped past clouds. Their reflections merged with the glass, ghost-like, as if the landscape itself bore witness to the slow unspooling of trust and companionship. They spoke rarely, letting silence carry meaning, a glance, a small nod. The shared recognition of survival, not only through hardship, but through the deliberate effort to care, to sustain, and to remain present. The girl noticed how his shoulders relaxed when he observed her attentiveness, how his expression softened as small successes. A patched fence, a kettle filled without spill, were quietly celebrated. Evenings carried their own rhythm. The fire was stoked and maintained, its light dancing across the walls and illuminating small victories. The repaired rocking chair now holding them both in rotation, the table cleared of dust and debris, the bed made with fresh linens. The girl traced her fingers over the old wood of the mantel, noticing carved marks left by long-forgotten hands, symbols of endurance and care that mirrored their present effort. Each shadow cast by the fire seemed alive with memory, yet softened by the warmth of new shared purpose. The cowboy, seated in the rocking chair for the first time since the storm, allowed himself a quiet exhale, noticing that tension no longer coiled so tightly within the cabin walls. Their shared labor, attention, and small, deliberate acts of repair had begun to dissolve fear and mistrust like morning mist under the sun. One night, as they sat in relative silence, the girl finally spoke a longer thought aloud, hesitant but steady. She spoke of how strange it felt to perform ordinary tasks, how odd it was to feel capable and safe at the same time. The cowboy listened, not offering advice or correction, only presence, letting the weight of acknowledgement serve as affirmation. In that moment, the bond between them deepened, not through grand declarations or dramatic gestures, but through the accumulation of small, careful acts that proved safety, competence, and trust. She realized, with a quiet astonishment, that intimacy could emerge from shared labor and constant, unwavering attention rather than from words alone. By the final hour of the day, when firelight cast long, golden shadows across the cabin, and the prairie beyond was awash in the muted violet of dusk. Both felt the subtle lift of isolation from their shoulders. They had weathered internal storms of pride, fear, and uncertainty, and through persistence, patience, and shared presence, they had created a fragile sanctuary of trust. The cabin, once merely a shelter from the physical elements, had become a vessel for emotional repair, a place where wounds could be tended with care, and where connection could be nurtured through quiet observation, deliberate touch, and the slow rhythm of everyday life. The girl rested her head briefly against the mantel, watching sparks drift upward from the hearth, and felt, perhaps for the first time, the assurance that she was not wholly alone in the world. The cowboy, leaning slightly forward in the rocking chair, allowed himself to meet her gaze, recognizing in her eyes the mirrored recognition of endurance, survival, and fledgling trust. The day had not been marked by declarations of affection or overt gestures of love, yet the subtle language of attention, shared effort, and perseverance had spoken volumes. Healing had begun quietly, slowly, like dawn breaking over the horizon, tentative yet irrevocable, carrying the promise of new beginnings beneath the still watchful roof of the cabin. The fire in the hearth had burned low that evening, glowing embers casting flickering light across the walls of the cabin. Its warmth was gentle, comforting, and familiar, but in its ease lay a careless risk. A stray spark, carried by the draught that crept beneath the door, caught on a pile of dry kindling stacked too close to the mantel. The small flame leapt hungrily, its glow bright and alarming against the dim interior. For a moment panic tightened the girl's chest and she froze, eyes wide with fear. The cowboy moved without hesitation, the rifle he had leaned against the wall moments before now forgotten. replaced by the urgent steadiness of hands trained to act in quiet crisis. He snatched a pan from the hearth and thrust it toward the growing flame, water sloshing over the rim, while she grabbed blankets, tossing them over the fire with trembling urgency. The room was filled with the scent of scorched wood and smoke, the heat rising like a living thing, wrapping around them both. Sparks floated in the air like fireflies, landing on the rug and wood floor, leaving tiny smoking marks in their wake. Their movements became a shared dance of coordination and instinct, a wordless conversation of urgency and trust. Hands brushed as they passed tools to one another. Eyes met in brief, acknowledging glances, and each realized the other's presence was a tether against fear. The fire was subdued with sweat, effort, and careful attention. The girl collapsed onto the rug, the shawl dampened and clinging to her shoulders, heart hammering in her chest. He knelt beside her, breathing heavily, but his expression held more than relief. There was a quiet pride, an acknowledgement of endurance and shared purpose. Firelight flickered across his face, illuminating the deep lines carved by grief and solitude, and in that light she saw vulnerability and moral steadfastness entwined. The scars on his hands, faint yet telling, spoke of years of labor, of struggle, of quiet survival. She felt a sudden surge of warmth, not only from the hearth but from the knowledge that he had chosen to protect, not merely from necessity, but from a commitment forged in silence and patience. They rose together, moving to inspect the hearth, the rugs, the small personal effects that had been threatened by flames. A photograph, slightly charred at the corner, and a small worn book were rescued from the nearest shelf. The girl's fingers brushed the photograph and she caught her breath, realizing how easily moments, memories, and lives could be consumed by a sudden spark. The cowboy's hand hovered near hers, steadying without touching, a reminder that protection could be silent, careful, and ever-present. The fire had been a crisis, but in its chaos lay revelation, the vulnerability of life, the immediacy of danger, and the undeniable strength found in shared effort. As the room cooled and the last wisps of smoke curled toward the ceiling, their movements slowed. They sank to the floor, knees brushing lightly, and the tension of the crisis bled into an intimate closeness that neither had anticipated. He spoke little, his voice a low timbre that seemed to echo with restraint and gravity. The girl, seated across from him, felt the quiet shift in the air, the unspoken acknowledgement of reliance, trust, and the faintest hint of desire. Firelight danced across their faces, highlighting the textures of skin and scar, shadow and curve, and in the flickering glow, vulnerability became visible, tangible, and safe to witness. She noticed how his eyes softened when they met hers, how his hands relaxed slightly after the emergency, and for the first time, she allowed herself to perceive the depth of his steadiness, not only in moments of action, but in moments of patient care. He had not demanded gratitude, had not sought praise, yet the intensity of his commitment resonated profoundly. She felt for the first time since being left bound to a fence, the stirring of something tender, something that might one day grow beyond safety into companionship, care, and perhaps even love. And he, seeing her cautious recognition, allowed a faint exhale to escape, a loosening of the stoic tension he had carried like armor for so long. The cabin settled into a hushed rhythm. Firelight from the hearth painted long, wavering shadows across walls and ceiling, mingling with the smoke that lingered in curls from the dampened kindling. The girl brushed a hand along the edge of the rug, smudged from soot and effort, and he followed her gaze, noticing the subtle ways she assessed her environment with care. They shared a quiet laugh, soft and tentative, at the near disaster and the absurdity of panic in the midst of quiet isolation. In that shared acknowledgement, a bridge formed, a wordless agreement that fear and courage, vulnerability and protection, could coexist without diminishing either. The girl tentatively moved closer to the hearth, drawing her knees under her chin, and he remained in the chair nearby, rocking slightly, watching the flames and shadows. Sparks, floating faintly above the coals, mirrored the unspoken stirrings between them, tiny, glowing reminders of fragility and hope. She noticed the careful tension in his shoulders, the deliberate manner in which he observed her comfort, and felt a strange gratitude, almost reverential, for the quiet, steadfast devotion that had been invisible until necessity made it visible. Here was courage exercised not in bravado, but in patience, endurance, and silent moral strength. The firelight played across their faces, illuminating the textures of life lived fully yet cautiously. Scars, lines, faint shadows of grief, and the first blush of unspoken connection. For a brief moment their knees brushed, shoulders nearly touched, and in that near embrace, each recognized the subtle breakthrough, the first tender acknowledgement that fear had yielded to trust, and that protection and desire could share the same space. Words were unnecessary. The room, filled with the scent of smoke, wet wood, and warmth, carried all the meaning that needed to be expressed. By the time the hearth burned down to glowing embers, and the cabin was quiet except for the occasional pop of settling wood, both felt an undeniable shift. The crisis had passed, leaving exhaustion, relief, and a closeness that had not existed before. The girl rested her hands on her knees, eyes reflecting the faint, lingering glow, and felt the faintest stirrings of hope that intimacy and trust could grow in the careful space of shared hardship. The cowboy leaned back, allowing the chair to rock softly, his gaze lingering on her with restrained warmth and recognition. They had faced fire, both literal and symbolic, and emerged not only unscathed, but bound together in the quiet certainty that emotional survival and courage were inseparable, and that the first tender threads of trust could now begin to weave into something lasting. Spring had arrived quietly, brushing the prairie with tentative green and painting wildflowers across the slopes where snow had only recently yielded to sun-warmed earth. The cabin, modest and solitary, stood like a sentinel in the awakening landscape, its repaired fence stretching uneven but steadfast against the horizon. Inside, the girl moved with a confidence that had been absent only weeks before, tending the hearth, stacking firewood, and adjusting the braid in her hair with care. Each motion reflected a newfound dignity, a subtle reclamation of self, the echo of strength earned in days of hardship and quiet endurance. The sound of hooves approaching carried a familiar weight. Authority, suspicion, and curiosity all mingled in a single rhythm. Lawmen rode into view, their leather boots heavy on the dry earth, hats pulled low against the lingering spring breeze. They carried the murmurs of townsfolk, whispers of rumors and half-remembered stories. A girl left to the cruelty of her father, a mysterious cowboy who intervened with neither fanfare nor claim to glory. Their eyes, sharp with intent, fell first upon the cabin and then upon its inhabitants, seeking answers, accountability, and perhaps the relief of closure. The cowboy stepped forward first, the line of his shoulders steady, the lines of his face calm yet resolute. He spoke plainly, his words measured and free of boast or exaggeration, recounting only what had been, the girl left tied to the fence, her father's drunken neglect, the necessity of rescue, and the quiet protection that had followed. He did not seek reward or admiration. His testimony was simply truth, offered without flourish. The girl followed, her voice steady and clear, conveying events with a calm authority that surprised even her. She demonstrated dignity, the sort that arises not from entitlement but from recognition of one's own worth and the courage to claim it. The lawmen listened, noting the consistency of each account, the absence of artifice or pride. The tension in the air, thick with unspoken judgment, began to dissolve under the quiet force of honesty. No one sought vengeance, no one demanded recompense. Moral clarity had been exercised through action, and it now spoke louder than rumor. In their eyes, the cowboy's steadfastness and the girl's reclaimed dignity were sufficient proof that justice, though wrought quietly and without ceremony, had been served. As the formalities waned, the girl and the cowboy prepared for their ride. Horses were saddled, reins checked, and each movement carried the quiet intimacy of shared understanding. They mounted, the rhythm of hooves against the earth echoing across the wide prairie. The wind carried the scent of wet grass, melting snow, and newly turned soil, symbols of the renewal that spring brought to both land and heart. They rode slowly at first, savoring the calm, then more freely, allowing the vast openness to stretch beneath them like a promise. The repaired fences along the trail bore witness to persistence, to the restoration of boundaries and safety. Each post and board reflected the labor of days spent in quiet cooperation, the embodiment of stability in a world previously unsettled. Horses galloped freely beside them, their energy mirroring the exhilaration of emotional release, the thrill of courage exercised and trust honored. The girl's braid, freshly done and shining in the sunlight, swayed with her movements, a symbol of continuity, care, and the reclamation of control over her own life. They rode past the remnants of melting snow, the wet earth beneath their horses' hooves smelling of renewal and possibility. Every ridge, every shallow stream reflected light in a way that felt emblematic of their inner transformation. Sharp shadows softened by brightness, harshness tempered by warmth. Moments of silence stretched between them, filled with unspoken acknowledgement of the trials they had endured, the dangers they had faced, and the quiet triumph of survival alongside steadfast companionship. Words were unnecessary. Presence, shared history, and the rhythm of motion sufficed to convey understanding, gratitude, and trust. At the horizon, the prairie opened fully, sunlight spilling across wildflowers in a riot of color. The girl glanced over her shoulder, noting the cabin receding behind them, its smoke faint against the rising warmth of day. She felt a sense of closure, tempered by the recognition that the past, bruises, fears, and abandonment remained part of her, yet had been honored, faced, and slowly transformed. The cowboy beside her, steady and silent, represented not only protection, but the moral clarity she had long sought, a living testament to courage exercised without display, devotion offered without expectation. As they rode, the wind carried away the last remnants of lingering tension. Each hill they crested, each stream they crossed, mirrored the movement of their lives from fear to fortitude, from isolation to connection. The prairie stretched limitless and forgiving, a landscape reborn in sunlight and rain, echoing the possibilities that had emerged in the cabin days before. They were not unscarred, yet each scar was acknowledged, accepted, and woven into the narrative of endurance and care. When they finally slowed their pace, the horse's hooves sinking slightly into softened earth, the girl turned her gaze toward him. For a fleeting moment, the vulnerability of the past met the steadiness of the present. No words were exchanged, yet in the space between them, the understanding was complete. Trust had been built, courage exercised, and connection made permanent by shared hardship and quiet attention. In that glance lay the promise of new beginnings, earned and deliberate, as natural and inevitable as the spring sun warming the prairie beneath them. The ride home was more than a return. It was a continuation of transformation. Fences repaired, braids redone, the rhythm of hooves across grass and soil, the wind carrying scent of rain and earth, all bore witness to the healing of wounds, both visible and hidden. They moved forward together, neither seeking dominance nor favor, but riding as companions forged in silence, action, and the unspoken acknowledgement of moral and emotional truth. As the sun climbed higher, painting the prairie in gold and amber, both knew that the landscape had changed within them. Isolation had been softened by connection, abandonment by protection, grief by steadfastness. Moral justice had been realized not through declaration, but through presence, action, and unwavering integrity. The prairie, in full bloom, mirrored the quiet hope in their hearts, a testament to the possibility of second chances, of dignity reclaimed and of lives reshaped by courage, trust, and enduring human connection.